Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. The history of political thought is filled with just so stories about the origins of the state. Rousseau's social contract or Hobbes's state of nature, for instance, going all the way back to Plato's Republic and before. Something I found interesting to do on this show is bring you both those accounts from the history of political thought, for instance covering Rousseau's constitutionalism last episode, but together with real-world examples of state formation, for instance covering the emergence of the first governments and the first kings with Moody al-Rashid. We are, though, and it's often not noticed, living through one of the most large-scale and ambitious and in many ways completely unprecedented attempts at state creation in all of human history, the European Union. Now, whether or not the European Union, as you will hear, is currently a state, is a matter of some contention. It's one of those debates that kind of goes into the, well, it depends what you mean by a state sort of territory. But if, as again we'll discuss, in response to the Ukraine war, we get common European defence capacities, which is to say an army, then I think it will be undeniable that we have created a state of some kind. So I thought it would be interesting to do an episode talking about the European Union, not so much from an institutional point of view, how does the European Court of Justice work, or how do parliamentary elections work, we'll touch on that, but from a political theory and a political philosophy point of view, what are the justificatory narratives that we tell about the EU? What are the challenges to its legitimacy that its critics front? How do we think about this thing in terms of political values as we are in the process of birthing a continental nation state, or at least it is the aspiration of some to birth a continental nation state? My guest today to discuss all this is Simon Hix, who is a very prominent and very distinguished political scientist. He's the holder of the Stein-Rocken Chair in Comparative Politics at the European University Institute in Florence. He was also the Harold Latsky Professor of Political Science at the London School of Economics. Simon is an expert in European Union politics and the author of several books on that, including What's Wrong with the European Union and How to Fix It, Democratic Politics and the European Parliament, and the Political System of the European Union. As always, if you like this show and you like this content, please do consider supporting. I don't interrupt these shows with any advertisement, I don't have any commercial sponsors, so all of this is made possible by the voluntary support of listeners. Thank you so much to everyone who already does that, and if you are able, consider chipping in. I've been recommending £2, £2 an episode, about the price of a very cheap cup of coffee. If you think it's about that valuable, consider chapping that in, but that is totally a suggestion. You can do more, less, whatever works for you. You can do that at patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. The links to that, together with all the episodes and everything else are on the website politicalphilosophypodcast.com. Apart from that, let's get straight into it. This is the European Union with Simon Hix. I am joined today by Simon Hix. Simon, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, for American listeners, and honestly probably some British listeners, can we start at the absolute basic? What is the European Union?
So the European Union is a new type of political system beyond the nation state. So, it's not really an international organization. It's more than an international organization. So it's much more than the UN or NATO. And it has certain attributes of a normal state. It's got regulatory power, it's got budgetary power, it's got a legislature, it's got an executive, it's got a judiciary. It's a quasi state. Might not think of it as a state. That's why I like to call it a political system, because it's clearly a political system. And as a political scientist, we understand and we can study political systems. It's a little bit more difficult if you start to call it a state, because then you get into questions of, well, if the EU is a state, what are the states underneath it if they're not? So in a sense, it in many ways feels very like the United States when the United States was first formed. There's a certain sort of quasi, and the United States was plural at the time. The United States are, and it was a union of states. And so the European Union is a union of states, a union of previous nation states. And so they've agreed to share their sovereignty, and they've created a de facto new political system beyond the nation state. It's the first genuine type of that system anywhere in the world at the moment. So it's far more than any other customs union or economic union that exists anywhere in the world. It has, as I said, state-like capacity for regulating the movement of people, of goods, of capital, for creating and regulating a market on a continental scale and having the power to set the rules for that market, for redistributing power from taxpayers in one country to people who live in other parts of Europe. So it has the budgetary powers of a state. And it has all the institutional architecture of that. It has an executive, the commission, it has a legislature, the governments and the European Parliament, and it has a judiciary, a Supreme Court, the European Court of Justice. So in that sense, it's far more state-like than a lot of people are willing to admit. And so in a sense, saying that is both, on the one hand, scary to Eurosceptics who say, oh my God, it's a state. We don't want to be part of this new state. And also, but for people who are defenders of it, they say, well, it's not really a state. It's a kind of political system that we voluntarily created and we can voluntarily leave. And just look at the UK. The Brits have decided to leave this thing. And that's, I think, the easiest way for me to explain it. And I often find it's easier to explain to American students than it is to explain to British or European students, because the design of it is very like the design in the United States. It's a multi-level political system. There's elements of federalism in it. There's lots of checks and balances. There's no one institution who has lots of power. So it's very Madisonian in its design, and that's deliberate. So to divide the power. So there isn't one dominant force inside the union, in very much the same way as the founding fathers designed the US Constitution, although we can perhaps get back to that later on.
Let me seize on, perhaps unfairly, one phrase you said there, which is whether we want to admit it or not. Do you think the state aspect has maybe been soft-pedaled in some justificatory narratives? So there's a story that I've heard, a number of times from a number of sources about the origin of the EU, which is, after the Second World War, we said, well, let's not do that again. And people said, let's achieve by trade what we can do by war. So we had free trade. But then, the regulations for what level of noise a lawnmower can make are different in Germany than they are in France, than they are in the UK. So we harmonised them. But the problem with harmonising them is you need some body that will decide what the level of noise a lawnmower can make is. So then you end up with kind of the seeds, the antecedents of some sort of government. And it kind of just snowballed from there, but almost as if no one ever really... The story kind of implies that no one ever really quite meant it to become a quasi-state, but clearly someone did, right?
There was so the way I like to characterize it is, there was a Hungarian economist who had a theory of economic integration, Balas, and he said that, once you create a free trade area, you decide you want to have common regulations. And so you create a kind of single market. And once you have a single market, you decide it's going to work best if we have a single currency. And once you create a single currency, you decide, well, it's really going to work best if we have sort of common budgets to harmonize the economy within the single. And then once you have common budgets, you decide you need to have kind of democratic capacity to decide how to spend those budgets. And before you know it, you've ended up with a political system and debates about democracy and accountability and which way are we going to take this? And so, you create a single market and you decide, who's going to decide the regulatory rules of this market? And do we want more left-wing type, social standards, environment standards, or do we want more right-wing liberal standards? And once you've created the free movement of people, you start to say, economically, we need the free movement of people to make the market work efficiently. And now you start to say, okay, how are we going to regulate that? We need common migration policies and common immigration policies and common border policies. And once you create a single market, you say we need common external economic policy and so on and so on and so on. So you're right. There's always been this kind of ratcheting, and it goes in sort of waves, but the waves are always upwards. And so you've had not necessarily a snowball, but a kind of gradual ratcheting at every stage. The member states have come together and said, we face a crisis. What should we do? Crisis has always been good for the EU because crisis has then meant a compromise deal that has taken another major step forward. So as you said, the crisis of the Second World War created the European coal and steel community and the European economic community. We then had the crisis in the 1970s of the economic crisis, and that was the pressure to create a single market when European countries just agreed we don't have big enough markets. Our market's not as big as the United States, and so we need a bigger market to compete globally and to have industrial champions that are European-wide and develop new technologies. So they created the single market and the single currency to make the single market work. And then you had, the financial crisis in 2008, and then you had a big step forward in sort of budgetary capacity of the European Union. And then you got COVID, and you decide, okay, you're going to have common European health policy purchasing, vaccines, and so the current crisis will probably need to lead to another major step forward in the process. The current global crisis, whether it's Trump in the US or Russia, will probably lead to a major step forward in defense integration. And we will finally get European Union with defense capacity. And once you get a European Union with defense capacity, then it really is difficult to say this isn't a new state we've created.
Well, then you've got Weber, Locke, and Hobbes would all sign up on that.
Exactly. And you can say, I would always find myself in trouble in Britain when Nigel Farage would say, Europe is going to have a common army, and all the defenders of the EU would say, no, it's not. And I'd say, well, maybe it is. You don't know. And it's kind of, I don't want to agree with him, but the logic of this is at certain, you could say, stop, we want to get off. And what I think is very interesting now is there's very few political forces on the continent inside the EU who actually want to follow Britain out. And it's interesting how the sort of radical right, the populist right, who traditionally were Eurosceptics, are now no longer really Eurosceptics. What they're saying is, as they come to power and they realize they have power, and now they're very influential in all the EU institutions, they don't want to get rid of the EU. They want to turn the EU into what they want. They want the EU to be a more confederal type, intergovernmental type body with decentralization of powers. And what powers they have at the European level, they want to use for their ends. They want to control Europe's borders. They want to have a restrictive immigration policy. They want to have a robust Europe first economic policy, a bit like Trump. So, it's interesting how the more you build that power, as forces come to power who are originally critical of it, they start to realize, whoa, wait a minute. There's some levers we can pull here to get the things we want that we're much more likely to get if we can coordinate at the European level. And if we just try to do it independently in a relatively small states in the global political economy that we have. And these are all relatively small European countries now. We're all pretty small numerically and pretty small economically and declining in population globally, relatively, and declining economically, relatively. And so Europe gives these states, in a sense, power and voice on a world stage. I mean, it is interesting in response to Trump how there's only really three countries who are seriously considering, or three unions that are seriously considering retaliation to Trump: China, the EU, and Canada. All the rest of them are going to roll over and tickle my tummy. But this is, the EU is one of them that if they weren't together united, they're one of the states who are really seriously thinking about retaliatory action and it being credible and impactful. The UK isn't in that situation anymore.
So I want to come back to the far right, and we might close with Trump. But I guess my follow-up question is it the case that, here's another common narrative, right? Because we have this sort of backwards-looking story about how the EU came to be, where we're almost walking backwards into statehood. It's just a trade agreement. But there's this thing, so we'll do harmonization. There's this other thing, so we'll do freedom of movement. that we kind of almost have a story of us walking into it accidentally, that because of that narrative, we've never developed a legitimacy narrative. So, I could tell you a legitimacy narrative about how the UK government works, which is we have popular sovereignty, people elect MPs, a majority party forms, which will then govern but submit itself back to the rule of the people. So in some sense, the laws it passes are authorised by them and accountable to them. Now, you can argue if that's a good story, you can argue if it works that way, or indeed has ever worked that way, but it's a story, right? And I could tell you probably a slightly different one about how, like, the congressional system in the US is supposed to work, which is a bit more diffuse, right?
Yeah, so the way that, yeah, I mean, I like to contrast the way sort of constitutional lawyers think about this stuff and political scientists think about this stuff. So I'm a political scientist, but constitutional lawyers would say the EU is procedurally legitimate. We elect our governments and the governments choose the Commission. We elect the European Parliament and we elect the governments. And so we have the Commission chosen by the governments and the Parliament. We now even have rival candidates for the Commission President before European elections. And the Commission President has to be elected by both a majority in the Parliament and the governments. So, and they have a vote of investiture. There's no vote of investiture in the UK. It's picked by the king, who the prime minister is. The parliament doesn't actually formally take a vote, which is unusual in a parliamentary system. So there's a formal investiture of this person by the two big representative bodies that we choose. We elect our governments, we elect the parliament, they choose the commission. Then once legislation is proposed by the commission, it has to go through the parliament, the government, we elect them, and then there's the checks and balances of the court and our domestic judiciary and everything. So and then there's rules that say we all have to be democracies and there's a free press and European, the European human rights legislation that says we've all got to have, the liberal side of liberal democracy. So procedurally, this is a democratic system. But as a political scientist, it doesn't feel like it. So, we think of the difference between procedural legitimacy and or procedural democracy and substantive democracy. Substantive democracy is where you genuinely have a battle between different visions of the direction of the country. And that's played out through electoral politics. And one side wins and one side loses, or one side wins and then forms some kind of coalition. But the mandate is created through that substantive process of democratic contestation. And so I've always argued that what the EU is missing and why it will never really feel democratic is it's sort of missing that really substantive democratic battle between different forces. Say, we tried to have this with the Commission President candidates before, which use the German word Spitzenkandidat, rival candidates before the European Parliament elections. This was the sort of best hope we could have, where there would be a sort of a left-wing vision for Europe and a right-wing vision for Europe, and one side would win and one side would lose, and you'd create some kind of opposition dynamics, and the people would be engaged in it, and they say, well, we lost this one and you guys won, but we'll get you next time. And that's the basis of democracy as we see it in a sort of substantive terms. So it's procedurally democratic, but it doesn't really feel substantively democratic. And so when there's government at the European level that has distributional consequences, the single market has got distributional consequences, economic and monetary union has distributional consequences, EU environmental legislation has distributional consequences. Farmers get annoyed about it. So if you feel you're on the losing side of what the EU is doing, you don't feel like that. Where was the legitimate mandate? Where was the event or the process that created that allows you to govern against my interests? And I think that's at the heart of the problem of the so-called democratic deficit in the EU.
Another way of putting that is there's kind of a mismatch between institutional structures and praxis, or sorry, a slightly long word for just like what people in the system think they're doing, right? And you see that in the UK. You definitely see that in the US, where you have like congressional institutions, but it really does seem like voters and politicians feel like they're in a parliamentary system. That's how they're behaving. In the EU, you have all of these systems, they're all democratic. The challenge seems to be, I know the UK case the best, but it seems to be in a number of countries. We use EU elections as a referendum on what we feel about our current domestic government. We have a Labour government, we're not too happy with them, let's vote some reform lads in, or whatever, right? that then becomes our European delegation. But we're not making those decisions with a view to what the decisions are sort of meant to do. That seems like the gap.
Right. So when the European elections were first held in 1979, there was a lot of optimism to say, this is it. We've got European-wide elections to a European-wide parliament. This is going to create European-wide mandate for these politicians, for this majority, for the parties that form. It didn't happen in the first elections. And political scientists at the time studying it coined this phrase second-order elections, meaning that the first-order elections are your main national parliament or national presidential election in France. And these are second-order elections. They're fought in the shadow of those first-order elections. And so they're protest votes, opposition parties win, small parties do well, environmental groups did really well in the mid-80s and early 90s, the radical right do particularly well in these elections, opposition parties do well, governing parties lose, and particularly small governing parties. And so you get that dynamic people thought would gradually go away, but it hasn't gone away. In a sense, European elections have been a failure. It's a terrible thing to say as a sort of pro-European, but European Parliament elections have absolutely failed in what they were meant to do. And we've tried to fix it. We've tried to say, well, it's because we don't all have the same electoral system. And so let's have a majority, let's have a PR system. And that didn't really work. And then they said, let's have these rival candidates, commission president, before. We've now had 3 European elections with these commission president candidates before the elections to give a sort of European flavor to the elections. That really hasn't worked either. And there's a debate about could there be common European-wide lists, like a certain percentage of these MEPs elected on common European-wide lists to force voters to actually have to make choices that are European choices. I'm skeptical that that will even work. And part of the problem, I think, is that this is the first time we're creating a political system beyond the nation state where we're replacing existing democracies. Existing democracies have locked in political identities, and those political identities are really, really hard to shift. And so, there was this lovely moment during the Brexit debate where David Cameron said, well, we just don't believe there could ever be democracy beyond the nation state, and we don't believe there could ever be a European demos. He even used that word. And then he wrote a letter that was published in 10 different European newspapers across Europe with the phrase, I don't believe there could ever be a European demos, which in fact he's acknowledging there in part is because he's writing this and publishing it, the same thing in 10 European newspapers all across Europe. That's the recognition that there is at least some common European narrative or understanding or debate. We've never really, though, moved beyond the beginnings of that. And we've got this debate about, do you have to create a demos first and then you get a democracy? Or would a demos result from the fact if you really did have proper... I'm on the side of demoses tend to be endogenous. The democratic identity evolves through the practice of democracy working and winners and losers. And sometimes you realizing you're on the good side or the bad side. I think if we look at the way democracy has evolved at the national level, there wasn't a demos necessarily where we had mass democratic elections. It evolves through party politics, through battles, through the creation of loyalties to particular figures and the creation of sort of party identities as sort of teams in politics. I support this team, you support that team. We've not really created that at the European level. And until we get that structure, that infrastructure, I don't think we're going to get the democratic identity evolve. And without that, we're never really going to have a truly democratic union at the European level.
But I mean, that seems optimistic, but then you could say, historically, that's not how, it came about in the UK or America. It wasn't that we had a group of people who all felt like they were a demos and had these properties that we might associate with that. And it's not as if I said there's a legitimizing narrative for how government should work in the UK. It's not as if we started with that narrative.
No. It's evolved a long time over time.
Around it. Our institutions grew up, particularly in the case of the UK, grew up over time. And then the narrative came along afterwards. You think the EU will eventually go down that road?
It's difficult to know, because an alternative view for most other democracies across the world is there was some defining democratic moment where a new state had to be formed and there was a constitutional moment. So a lot of the sort of constitutional lawyers that I interact with this is why they're so passionate about a European constitution. They want this kind of constitutional moment, a bit like the sort of founding fathers and the Federalist Papers in the US, or the French Constitution, or the German Basic Law in 1949, or, they want this kind of constitutional moment where there's a coming together of elites, there's a coming together of the people, and they form this founding document that says this is the basic document of how our democracy works. And then they go out and they have a democratic contest to elect the new parliament on the basis of that constitutional moment. And that's what people thought they were trying to do with the European Constitution that failed. And I think it failed because although the elites recognized that there was this sort of, we need this constitutional moment, it was a wake-up call to many of the publics across Europe saying, wait a minute, you're telling us we've created this state? How did that happen? Where did I get a say? So it's almost like we've created this thing, we now want to constitutionalize it. And people were saying, you're now telling me this thing has been created? I wasn't aware of this at all. So you can see this mismatch between the kind of perception of the everyday citizens of Europe and the kind of de facto understanding of the people involved in it, who work with it, who study it, who teach it, who engage with it as journalists, as lawyers, as academics, as politicians, as business people, who live and breathe the system as it works, really understand this is a pretty powerful thing we've created. But if you're not engaging with it every day, your daily life is your national political system. It's not that European thing. So we haven't had that constitutional moment. And I used to think it will evolve. It would evolve slowly. But it really hasn't evolved anywhere beyond where we were in 1979 very much. I mean, it hasn't fundamentally shifted. European identity hasn't been created. The early philosophers of European integration thought that through this process, we'd have European identity would gradually replace national identity. As at the nation state level, national identities replaced regional or local linguistic identities, and these nation states were created, a lot of them in the 19th century. They thought this would be the process of creating a European identity. There's very little evidence that European identity has shifted much at all in the last 30 years. It's a tiny proportion of the publics in opinion surveys who say, we have a European identity. Even a European and a national identity is a tiny proportion. And that hasn't shifted. So the evolution has been very, very slow, and I think we're pretty much stuck. We're stuck in an equilibrium, which is that most people's identities are national identities, their democratic identities are national democratic identities, and then we've created this rather ad hoc political system at the European level with lots of checks and balances that's not particularly legitimate. And because of that, it's heavily constrained in what it can do. That's a bit frustrating to a lot of people. And so we're sort of stuck. The European Parliament elections haven't done this. Legal integration with the Court of Justice hasn't really created this. There's a famous saying by a legal theorist who studied the European Court of Justice and wrote a book about it. His opening line was, tucked away in the fairy tale Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, a court has crafted a legal union of Europe. It's kind of this court has created legal integration, but most people don't really realize that either. So I don't really see how we change this equilibrium we're stuck in, and I'm not particularly optimistic about that.
Let me give you my view, and this is much more grounded in the UK, so maybe you can bring in some other countries as well, as to one of the things that's gone wrong with the selling the EU to the public thing. I think when the Brexit debate happened, we meaning the pro-European side, defended the EU somewhat reluctantly and very instrumentally. Look, the EU, it's a bit faffy and bureaucratic and complicated, but don't you understand there's all these economic benefits? Don't you understand if we leave, this will suppress GDP? And all of those arguments turned out, I think, to be correct. What there wasn't was an argument in terms of core values. There was a little bit of it immediately after Brexit. You started getting a much more impassioned, classically liberal, I like that I can live and work anywhere in Europe. That is a form of freedom to me that I value and I want it. I like that other people can come and work in our country. I like living in a diverse, pluralistic society. So there was a period just after Brexit where you got those sorts of arguments being made quite forcefully. And then it seems that slowly sort of faded out step by
It's
step.
very different to contrast it with the referendum in 1975, which is interesting. You did have all of the sort of instrumental arguments and the more ideological fundamental arguments on both sides. This time round, it was a bit skewed because, in a sense, you had three campaigns. You had the two official campaigns who were both instrumental. Both are kind of short. The pro-European campaign was, we don't really like the EU, but if we leave it, it's worse. And then we had the anti-European, which was, we don't really like the EU, and if we leave it, it's going to be a little bit better. And then you had Farage saying, fundamentally, it's about national sovereignty, take back control, blah, blah, blah. And this is about freedom for Britain. But we didn't have the mirror image of that on the other side. And in fact, Cameron and co running that campaign prevented Clegg, who wanted to actually run an openly pro-European campaign contrasting against Farage, making the kind of case that European integration is an unbelievable thing we have created in our little corner of the world. We've created the probably freest polity you can imagine that's been created in human history for our little part of the world. Our ability to live and work and travel and consume products and marry who we want and do what we want, consume what we want, get educated where we want, set up a business anywhere we want, do business with whoever we want. We've created a polity that allows us to do that in our little corner of the world. Every other part of the world looks jealously at us. This is Southeast Asia would love to have this kind of thing. Latin America would love to have this thing. Africa would love. We've managed to do it in Europe because we've designed a clever set of institutions to govern it that have lots of checks and balances, that enforce us to get compromises, that allow us to kind of regulate and harmonize because we have a common shared set of values about how we rule this market we're in. It's a remarkable achievement historically.
I think
so. Nobody was making that kind of case on the other side.
I think the challenge to making that kind of case, though, is you've got to do more than just trot it out at an election and then forget about it. Like, values are inculcated over time. But I think the challenge is voters, well, not voters, all of us, we think first from values and then we organise our policy commitments around them. And what's happened, I think, in a number of key respects, is politicians in the short term have been leery of making the values case. So another example of this would be everyone sort of agrees that what Trump is doing right now with tariffs and with immigration is bad. And yet, the Democratic Party has not been making a principled case for free trade or for the benefits of immigration across the Biden term. Like, they were very much buy and made in America. And I understand, and they were very much like, we're going to get tough on the southern border, right? And I understand why they do, because if you look at a map of the states that they've got to win, they are taking a short-term disadvantage to make the principled case. There is no doubt. But the problem with that is that then when you get to the position of a Trump, you're then in a position where you're not able to clearly explain why what is happening is wrong, except perhaps that it's gone too far or that it's been done ineptly, which it certainly has. But that's not the case you'd really like them to be making. You'd like them, and
Trump is backpedaling because the markets have crashed, not because of opposition to what he's been doing on immigration. Right? So,
yeah, but that seems to me.
No, I can tell you what. The way I think about this is, you're exactly right, and one of the things that has happened across the world is politicians becoming more and more timid. Why is that? And I think it's because time horizons of politicians have got shorter and shorter and shorter. The time horizon of a politician, if you're lucky, is 48 hours. So it's making those kind of cases. You need to, there's a famous saying by Luxembourg Prime Minister, I think, which is Jean-Claude Juncker, when he was Luxembourg Prime Minister, said, we all know what we need to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected once we've done it. And so, that applies across the board for politicians. They all know what kind of argument they need to make, but they don't know how to then win elections once they've made it, right? So it's because the media they're worried about the knee-jerk. And the thing that happens in a knee-jerk way is not the kind of careful thinking or Maybe that's an interesting argument. They're thinking, how is this going to affect me and my family and in the very short term? My job, my income, my household income, the opportunities for my children. That's ultimately what drives a lot of politics now. So there's no room for people to make a broader, why should we invest the climate crisis? Why should we address, and how should we address the climate crisis? Very, very difficult issue to address. And it's going to become increasingly so as the policies to address that are really starting to bite. And we're starting to see that. So it's exactly the same as conflict between the kind of long-term time horizons and short-term time horizons. So the argument you make for kind of Europe and European integration is a sort of broader long-term look, there may be sometimes you win, sometimes you lose in the short term, but in the long run, this is what's in our collective interest in the long run, to create this union, to govern ourselves collectively. It's a difficult thing to do, but ultimately for all of us collectively, this is in our enlightened self-interest, if you will. It's almost impossible as a politician to make that kind of argument about anything, let alone Europe.
But then you set yourself up for failure in the long run, because you end up in this position where you're sort of saying, look, the nativists are right, we should be making things ourselves and not letting people in. And, the EU's a bit foreign and bureaucratic and suspect. But you just go with me this one time. It feels like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, because you are.
And it's a little different, I think, for Britain in several respects. So Britain, I think, is distinct to the continent in several respects. So one, of course, is this sort of English-speaking, Anglo-Saxon identity. So, surveys have always shown in Britain, when you ask people, what other country in the world do you identify most with if it's not Britain? And about half respondents would say another English-speaking country, Ireland, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, or India. And about half would say a European country, Spain, Germany, France, Italy, and so on. So we've always had that sort of split identity. England as an Anglo-Saxon or as an English-speaking country has always had one foot in the Anglosphere and one foot on the continent. There's no other European country that really has that. Spain a little bit, but not quite. France sees itself very much as a European society. We see ourselves as partly European society, but partly an Anglo-Saxon society. And I think a lot of my students, I remember when I was teaching at LSE, British students would be surprised when I show them data from the World Values Survey data to show that if we take all the values in the survey, or they ask people a whole bunch of their attitudes to a whole range of different things, and you run some sort of scaling metric, that Britain, English people come out closest in the world to Flemish. Not to the Americans, not to the Australians, not to, but most British people don't think that we think we're most like the Americans. And interestingly, a globalized world has actually led to, I think, increasing connections amongst that Anglosphere, strengthening those connections. Kids consuming American media, Netflix and Amazon and God knows what else, all watching American TV, using American language. The Economist had this very interesting piece the other day about Americanisms in the English language now used in England. And so I think there's been a growing strengthening of that English-speaking identity, ironically. This is what Churchill always wanted, but it's actually got here. So that's been a kind of unique thing for England. It has always made it difficult to make a case about we are European. Britain is European. And we even have in our language, we say in Britain we do that and in Europe we do that, meaning on the continent they do that. So it's difficult to construct a narrative that says Britain is a European country, we are Europeans, we are part of European society, we should be part of this thing that governs European society. So that's a really distinct thing for Britain. The other thing as well, I think, is just simply geography. My sister lives in the Netherlands. She's British. Her husband is British. Her kids have grown up there. They experience Europe every day. They'll go shopping in Germany, or they'll go travel to France, or they experience that they are European. They're part of Europe. I live now in Italy. I can get on a train here in Florence and go to Paris, or it's pretty easy to go to Austria, go wherever I want to, and you experience Europe. In Britain, I think, and with globalization and global travel, most young Brits, my generation, used to go interrailing. Most young Brits now are thinking, oh, I want to go to Thailand, or I want to go to America, or I want to go to Australia. So I think there's been a gradual unraveling or eroding of the European bit of British identity, and a strengthening of the sort of English speaking or global part of identity. And the more Britain, of course, becomes a multi-ethnic, multi-faith society with migrants from elsewhere in the world, the more that strengthens the non-Europeanness of British identity. I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm just saying it's just a sort of de facto. So I think there was going to be a point where Britain really did have to make a choice. And that's why I was actually in favor of the referendum. I was much more sanguine. Look, if we lose it, we lose it. Britain's a rich country. They'll live and Europe will live. And, this is not the end of the world either way. Britain will feel different if we leave and probably will be a little bit poorer, but not much. But at least we will have had that debate and we would have had that lancing of the boil, and we would have made a choice about the direction going forward. And so I was very much in favor of that referendum because I was seeing which way we were heading and what the future was holding. And it was only going to get more and more problematic, I think.
It was coming. Whether or not we did it in the right way, the referendum, and how it
Yes.
was argued and how it was implemented, I think could be said left some room for improvement. But that debate wasn't going away. It had been festering for 2 decades. I guess though, if we can say, to put it at its mildest, the argument for European liberalism has not been made at its strongest in the UK. How are we faring in continental Europe? Because while on the one hand, it seems like Brexit has provided something of a cautionary tale for everyone, on the other, it doesn't seem like mainline liberalism is in a position of great strength on the continent either in national elections or European ones. I realize that's quite a broad question.
No, that's true. Liberalism, in that sense, sort of mainstream, the core of centrist, liberal, cosmopolitan politics, which has dominated European and American politics over the last 50 years, the sort of liberal with a small L, rather than liberal with a big L as a political party. Liberalism in terms of free markets, social liberalism with a welfare state, and liberal values in terms of gradually extending rights to individuals of different kinds, gender rights, transsexual rights, and so on, migrant rights. And so, that core liberal agenda was the core of the EU, the core of national politics, but it's also the core of what the EU does. It's about creating a market so we can trade, but the fundamental rights are part of that. One of the first things the EU did in the single market was create this non-discrimination directive. Non-discrimination in contracts or employment contracts on the basis of race and gender and ethnicity and sexual orientation and age. This was pretty progressive by many countries in Europe. This was very progressive. In Poland, when they had to join the EU, suddenly had to fundamentally change their fundamental rights laws to give gay people rights in Poland they'd never had before. And so it's it raised the gender equality. So in a sense, the rise of the populist right, or the post-liberal agenda, as people are sort of calling it, is a major threat to liberal values, or that core consensus at the national level as well as at the European level. But as I was saying, it's not necessarily a threat to the European Union as it's now constructed. What I see as relatively positive in a way is the national battle is being played out at the European level on what to do with this EU that we have created. The populist right, the post-liberal right, want to turn the EU into what they would like it to be. And the liberals are fighting back and want to keep the EU they'd like it to be. We're seeing this battle, for example, on two areas: migration. The liberals would say we need the EU to be very open and liberal migration. We're open, welcome to the world. We want common European migration policies, and we want a sort of liberal protection of asylum seekers. The right are saying, no, we now have instruments at the European level in which we can actually be very restrictive. We can restrict asylum. We can have rules that say you can only apply for asylum in the current state that you arrive in, and if you don't get it, the EU is going to pay to kick you out, and the EU is going to have you offshored in Albania or in Libya or somewhere, and the EU will pay for that. The EU is going to strengthen our borders. And we're seeing it playing out with environment legislation. The Liberals are saying we want this very progressive European Green Deal, a very ambitious deal, get rid of petrol cars, get rid of the internal combustion engine, fundamentally get rid of coal and coal-fired power stations, upgrade, you have the highest standards in the market for environmental standards. And the post-liberal right are saying, no, this is imposing costs. We need to kind of strip all this back and go back to basics. And so this is at the heart of the core battle going on at the European level. But very few people on the right are saying we want to get rid of the euro. We want to fundamentally tear the EU to pieces. We want to leave the EU. Meloni in Italy here. In opposition, she was very critical of the EU, and at one stage she was in favor of Italy leaving the euro. She's now in government, and she's saying, no, she's very much in favor of what the EU is doing. She feels she has allies at the European level, in the Council, in the Commission, in the European Parliament, and she thinks the wind is blowing in her direction. So she's, in a way, she's pretty pro-European in that sense.
I mean, are those the two? We talked about we need parties and supranational political identities to compete. Are those two going to become the two sort of parties in Europe? Is that it's not going to be a mainline conservatism and versus mainline socialism versus a sort of progressive liberalism? It's going to be classical liberalism versus the new right. That's our two identities.
It's interesting in that. That's largely the identity at the national level now. I wouldn't call it necessarily classical liberalism, because classical liberalism, I think the classical liberals are the ones who are most cross-pressured. Classical liberals are in some places they go with the right, with the new populist post-liberal right, in a sense, Musk backing Trump. And you see that.
I'm not sure I'd call Musk a classical liberal.
He was. As a kind of libertarian.
That's a whole other story, but go on with the
okay.
European
so
story.
Forza Italia in Italy is very classical liberal as a political party, and they've sided with Meloni. I think the characteristic of the kind of classical liberals like Macron, I guess, versus Le Pen. But so it's a kind of a liberal coalition against a conservative/nationalist coalition. In a sense, we're back to politics of the 1890s and 1910.
Yeah.
We're back to that era. We're back to a kind of liberal bloc with elements of social liberalism and elements of socialism as part of it. It's sort of John Stuart Mill and Asquith and Lloyd George and the French Parti Radical, if you like, versus the nationalists. Who want to roll the clock back, who don't like free trade, who don't like these new liberal values, who don't like necessarily the new rights for women and sexual minorities, who want to protect their traditional society, traditional values. That's very much the politics of the 1890s. It's the Dreyfus affair. I feel very much like European politics today, or even global politics today, is very like that. Maybe the 100 years between was just an interregnum. Maybe that was weird, and now we're back to kind of normal democratic politics. Normal democratic politics are these two powerful ideas. One, we want to save and preserve traditional society and traditional values and traditional structures of society, like the family. And one that says, no, we progress and we want to fundamentally change things and we need to build for the future. And I think, that's very much the politics we have at the national level in many places in Europe. Not everybody fits that well. We're definitely seeing that in the Netherlands. We're seeing that in France. We're seeing that in Italy. Germany's a little bit different. I think the CDU have now done this deal with the SPD. The CDU, I wouldn't necessarily call them a liberal party. They're quite conservative on a range of different issues. And I think in many other contexts, a lot of the CDU would have gone with the AfD. That, you know, it's the particular German legacy that's preventing that. But in many other countries, you see the more conservative wing of the centre right being very tempted by a more populist radical right nationalism, being tempted by the European equivalent of the MAGA agenda. The Conservative Party in Britain has gone down that route, for example. And I think it's very uncomfortable for the more liberal wing of the Conservative Party. So the real cross-pressured people, I think, are the liberal wing of the centre right, the sort of right liberals who are free marketeers but socially liberal. I mean, you know, they're the most cross-pressured people in modern politics. Do they go with a left that includes some quite radical left, or do they go with the right and hold their nose, which includes some pretty unsavory nationalist, racist, authoritarian types? And that's definitely at the European level as well. But the centre currently is holding at the European level. You have a bloc that is the sort of centre-right, the Liberals, the Social Democrats, and the Greens. That's the governing bloc at the European level. And Meloni is a bit on the outside of that, but they do ad hoc deals with some of the more populist right figures. You know, we've got populist right governments in Italy, in Slovakia, in the Netherlands, and we've got populist right parties in government in a whole bunch of other places. And we may end up with the populist right in government in Spain at some point, in Portugal, in a whole bunch of other countries in Western Europe. So
it does really feel like everything's becoming the populist right versus everyone else. Like in American politics, this has actually been the case for a while now. You don't feel the tensions as much because that everyone else is just within the Democratic Party now. But like the way I put it is we have the Starbucks CEO and literal communists. Like, you know, like that all has to exist within one party, which presents certain challenges. I guess my final question, though, would be one of the question of convergence. Because, you know, when we started this era about 10 years ago with the sort of twin shocks of Brexit and Trump's election, a lot of people said, yeah, this feels the same and they have similar vibes, but they have very different historical pathways in, and the structural things that led to them are wildly different. And I bought that argument. At the same time, and when I'm asked to explain Trump, I don't explain him as some wild aberration. I think Trump is actually quite, if not predictable, at least explicable within the broad strokes of American history. But what people will say back to me now is, and yet, Toby, and yet, everywhere this sort of force seems to be on the rise, it's in Europe, it's in India, you know, it's in the States, and it increasingly is taking on common forms. You have Putin talking about J.K. Rowling being cancelled. Like, there's something other than just oh, well, America has the Deep South and Britain has these things. And there's something more than that. There is a convergence. I guess the question for me with the EU is, to what extent is that convergence happening? Because the two issues that are really pushing it right now, Ukraine and whatever the hell just happened with tariffs, seem like ones that would pull our nationalists away from where global nationalists are. Like, presumably our nationalists don't want to surrender Ukraine and pay higher taxes. And yet there does seem to be a very strong, I don't want to say force, that's a bit metaphysical, but a very strong tendency towards far-right convergence globally.
Yeah. So I think, you know, you could say we now have a very globalized world, so things happen in one country inevitably have impacts on things happening in other countries. But I actually think this is not that unusual in democratic politics across the world. When we think about the rise of socialists and social democratic parties, they were all very similar all across the world, and they learned from each other, and they shared ideas, and they shared manifesto commitments, and they even visited each other. And, you know, so, and then the Green parties emerged in the 70s and 80s. And so, I mean, you get these global forces that emerge, and there are some structural reasons why, because in the end, our societies are all very, very similar. We're all experiencing very, very similar things. We're experiencing dislocations from global trade, but actually dislocations from technological change are faster, if you believe The Economist. More than 2/3 of jobs in manufacturing have basically been lost because of automation, not because of globalization. But that's had the rapid decline of manufacturing in the West has happened everywhere. Germany's a little bit lagged, but they're having it now as well. We've seen fundamental changes in terms of gender equality and gay rights, and that we've had that right across the world. All the democratic world, almost everywhere now, has gay marriage and rights for gay couples, and has a similar debate about trans rights and so on. So we've got, and we're all migrant societies. We've had very open liberal immigration policies, and that's fundamentally changed our societies. So all of these trends, these deep structural economic and social trends, have been experienced in similar ways. All of us have got very, very high levels of individual income inequality, and all of us have now got very, very high levels of regional inequality with these kind of globalized cities and areas of the country that are left behind. So it's like everyone has got the same recipe, and you mix it up and you end up with a similar cake, right? And that cake means that you've got these populist right forces. They're all saying similar kinds of things. We want to preserve the family. We want to protect the left behind people. We don't like this kind of liberal cosmopolitan elites that's lording it over us. We don't like globalization. We want to protect jobs. And, but you're right that then one of the real problems, of course, is when Trump does what he's doing. These are nationalists by definition. And the one thing nationalists don't like is each other. So it's very hard to coordinate anything across these people or across these groups. And this has always been the problem in the EU. So they used to say that, the one I used to say to the UKIP doesn't like, the only thing the UKIP doesn't like more than the EU is the French. So there's no way that actually UKIP could do a deal with Le Pen. Right? So Trump is going to introduce these tariffs if he does. This is already driving a wedge down the middle of the radical right in many parts of Europe. In Italy, we've got Salvini here lauding Trump and loving Trump. But of course, Fratelli d'Italia, the other populist right party here, is saying this is a disaster for Italy and a disaster for the European economy. And they're not apologizing for Trump. They don't criticize Trump, but because they like him. But they say things like, we need to protect Europe. We need to protect European jobs. We need to negotiate with Trump. And they're going to resist any retaliatory measures by the EU because they don't want anything that goes anti-Trump. So a lot of the populist right like Trump, but they're going to try and make apologies for any impact of what he's doing on Europe. And so I do think there is a European-wide, a global trend of these types of forces that have resulted from very similar economic and social changes that we've witnessed over the last 30 or 40 years. And they're not going away.
Yeah, that's sort of my answer, though, is you don't even need to necessarily go down big materialist explanations. You can, but why is everything sort of happening together? Because people talk to each other. People
they do.
riff ideas off one another. And then particularly in our current age, you have what I call online activists, just people who spend a lot of time talking about politics online. And they kind of feed into political messaging in a way. And they all talk to each other, and that's global. And that's another integration factor.
They already did. I mean, yeah. In a sense, it's at a level or a magnitude that we've never seen before. But, all the socialists were reading the Communist Manifesto. When we passed when the beverage report was passed in Britain, all the socialist parties across Europe went, "Oh, that's a great way to frame the challenges we have to face in society."
Yeah. Or the interwar development of fascism would be another one. They all had little conferences and talked to each other, didn't they?
And then the Green parties in the 80s, all similar sorts of things. But what's interesting is we don't really have that. There was a window of the Blair, Schroeder, Clinton, progressive politics world. Mandelson was chairing this progressive politics network, and he had Cardozo, and he had a bunch of other figures from other parts of the world. There doesn't seem to be something today that is trying to articulate what is it, the progressives, the social democrats, what is it we need to be doing as a group or as a political tradition across? It seems absent. Absent.
Because it is. And, I've talked about this a lot in the US case. I think there's been, as you put it, a timidity on the part of our politicians. And I think the liberals have often got caught on the wrong side of just preference orderings. For the people who don't like immigration, that is their number one thing. For the people who are okay with immigration, well, yeah, they are, but it's not their number one thing. And so there's always just a bit of a short-term hit of giving us straightforward values, even if it's majority sentiment, pro-immigration argument. So our politicians have been, I think, timid or perhaps just short-termist, I think.
But there's another side. That's right. But there's another side of it. Go on.
But at the same time, political arguments aren't just made by politicians. There's this kind of mid-level, what I call like the activist class, between the public and the politicians, who are people like me, right? We're not running for office, but we talk about politics.
Sort of Ezra Klein would be the equivalent in the US. The sort of
yeah. I mean, he's a lot bigger than me, but even just people with 2,000 Twitter followers who bang on about it, like that sort of person. And I think what I really want to think about and theorize is why mainline progressive, but not like hyper-radical liberalism, kind of seems to be at a bit of a low watermark with those people too. Because we don't face the same long-term, short-term constraints that make our politicians timid. And yet, that sort of people who yap on online space seems to be increasingly taken up by a sort of Corbynist Sander left. And fine, but there's been an increasing, in both traditional media and new media, and like I say, just the activist types, there's been a step-by-step fading out of a sort of progressive liberalism. And that's something I don't have a great answer for, and I want to think about why
I agree with that. I agree with that. And that's a really good point. I don't really have a good answer to that. And I think there's a big generational shift. I get accused by my younger colleagues of being a centrist boomer dad. I keep saying I'm Gen X. I'm not a boomer, but still I'm a centrist dad, even though I think of myself, from my political tradition that I come from, I'm kind of pretty mainstream center left. I'm not a centrist, but how the world has moved, and I'm, so I think that's absolutely right. It's interesting to see those voices now emerging in the US. I mentioned Ezra Klein.
Yeah.
I think he is really leading the charge of trying to regenerate or generate a new type of political narrative for that mainstream progressive liberal agenda. I don't see that so much anywhere in Europe.
No.
And one other thing I was going to say, and part of the problem, I think, is because what a lot of these parties or movements have become all across Europe is a coalition of interests.
Yeah.
They've become a coalition of each of these types, the environmentalists, the teachers, a coalition of different groups who each want their own thing. And any effort to bring that together ends up annoying or pissing off one or more of these other groups. And so again, it's the timidity it's becoming really, really hard to set out a coherent agenda, because as soon as you write something down or as a coherent agenda, you're going to suddenly start to annoy everybody, because none of these groups want to compromise. They all want. So we know in party politics that we study in political science, we talk about a two-dimensional political space, an economic left-right and a social liberal conservative, and we talk about the fact that the bulk of the population of Europe are actually economically moderate left wing and socially liberal. This should be the bulk of kind of core mainstream politics. Almost every country in Europe has 3 or 4 or 5 political parties in that space, and they squabble like cats in a bag. So, and we've sort of left the other 3 quadrants of that space to the populist right, who are able to appeal to the economically left-wing social conservatives and able to appeal to the right-wing libertarians. Italy's a brilliant case of this. Italy, the 3 right-wing parties managed to form a coalition before the last election to back Meloni, and you had a kind of economic free marketeers of Forza Italia. You had the real arch nationalists who were quite left-wing on economics, Lega Nord, and you had Fratelli d'Italia, who are the sort of socially conservative economic right-wingers. And they had a coalition. Meanwhile, the left had about 7 or 8 parties in that one quadrant, could not form a coalition. Had they formed a coalition ahead of the election, they'd have won the election. And they fought like cats in a bag. So I think this is an issue across the world.
Although I'm dual national American-British, the American in me will say that having them all in one party doesn't necessarily solve the cat's in the bag problem.
I agree.
Either.
It's a cat's in a bag inside the Democratic Party.
Should we pause it there?
Well, I think we should, yes.
Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Just before you go, is there any way you'd like to let listeners know to follow you? Twitter, Blue Sky,
Blue
website?
Sky. I've left Twitter. You can follow me on Blue Sky. I think it's Simon J. Hix on Blue Sky. Got about 10,000 followers. Happy to have many others join me. Most of my feed is political commentary on European politics, occasional stuff on American politics about, for example, Adam Pravorsky's been writing a fantastic diary. He's an American political scientist now in his 80s. He's writing a fantastic diary. I would advise read that diary on Substack. And then a few things about live music, because I go to a lot of live gigs across different parts of Europe. So if you want to follow me, that's the kind of stuff you're going to get.
Awesome. Simon, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks very much.